Welcome to Culture Crush with me, your host, Dan Dowman, where we get to meet some of the world's leading culture shapers, future makers, and power shakers. We're talking groundbreaking cultures, leadership challenges, and what you can do about them. Today on the show, I am joined by, I'm going to say, power shaker, Alice Haar. Alice, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I said power shaker with good reason, because one of the reasons why I approached you to be a guest on this show was because you're not afraid of having an opinion on LinkedIn and cutting through the noise, cutting through the crap, and telling people what you think about some of life's challenges and issues. You speak from the heart on social media, and it's not kind of coiffed and polished, and you're not trying to, you're just being your authentic self when you show up online, which kind of sounds like I'm trying to make you feel good and trying to pump you up, but it just happens to be true. And before we dive into anything else, I'd love to hear about kind of what are some of the things that you're championing at the moment, because that's why I came to you and said, hey, you're cutting through the noise here. I'd love to have a conversation with you. So what are some of the stuff that's kind of a priority, a bugbear, something that you want to challenge at the moment?
Well, thank you so much for the kind words on LinkedIn. I can assure everybody that I'm just as nervous before I hit post. I've probably just got a little bit more used to it now. And although I do share very openly about things that other people might consider pretty vulnerable and raw, there was a piece of advice that I read one day, which was when you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. And for me, that really resonated, of just kind of showing up and being oneself. It just felt very liberating. And I've only really ever got positive reinforcement for it. So for anybody that's scared of posting, I still get the, oh gosh, have I said something wrong? Have I offended somebody after I've hit send? And that's all normal. But yeah, I've only ever had good vibes back, which has been so lovely. And in terms of what am I championing? So I think at the moment, I'm very much championing parenthood, working parenthood. So I have a 3-year-old and I am 34 weeks pregnant with my second daughter. And so I think being a working parent has its bonuses and it also has its struggles. So that's definitely something that I'm trying to fly the flag for and remind people that it is tough, but they're not alone in the struggle and the triumphs.
So 34 weeks pregnant. I mean, this kind of makes Culture Crush like one of the final things that you will do, I imagine, work-wise before you go on maternity leave. How is the schedule looking for the next 4 weeks? Like, have you got many things like left in the diary?
Well, as a classic overachiever, I'm trying to get an on-demand course out the door before I go off on maternity leave. So I have planned to stop working in mid-July. And then I took on a couple of extra gigs, because when you work for yourself, you've got to make hay while the sun's shining. So I deliver my final workshop for one of my biggest clients, Bloom and Wild, on Wednesday. This is provided that the little lady stays where she is for now. And then, just a casual 10-hour on-demand evergreen course that I've got to record and upload and get all sorted before I finish.
Well, remarkable, and best of luck with that. And I have to say, I'm kind of glad that this isn't like the last thing, because I'm not sure if that would be kind of like a wonderful moment if you and I having a conversation was kind of the final thing that happened before a baby, or whether it would be kind of like a crushing indictment somehow. I don't know whether it would have been a good thing or a bad thing. So I'm glad there's a buffer.
It would have been a good thing, because this is one of the things that gives me lots of joy. I love talking to interesting people about interesting topics. So thanks so much for having me. It's a really nice way to mark the ending of this chapter and the beginning of the next.
Now, we talked about some of your posts, and one of the ones that you've, I think just a couple of days ago, you did talk about your earlier self when perhaps you were asking questions around, marriage and having a family, and kind of like there being a bit of a waiting period when, we've all been there, when we've kind of been in that space of like, and many people obviously are still in that space now. We're kind of waiting for the next thing to happen and we're not sure when it's going to come, whether it be relationships or jobs or kind of like a breakthrough of another kind. And your words are really lovely about what you would say to yourself looking back and encouraging yourself to trust the process, that the universe is for you. It has it in hand. Things are going to happen. I just wondered if you wouldn't mind, since we're talking about kind of cutting through the noise and kind of like this vulnerable act of posting on social and getting that warm feedback from other people, for people who are kind of in that waiting period and they're like waiting for the next thing, right? They're in that kind of gray area before things are falling into place. What would be your words of encouragement to help people stay the course and kind of not kind of lose hope when they're in that situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's another really famous adage that talks about the best day to plant a tree was 30 years ago. And the next best day to plant a tree is today. And I think for anybody that's in that sort of holding pattern, that waiting game, the only thing that we can do during that time that we have actual autonomy and control over is taking action. And so taking affirmative action as best we can. So for example, let's take, before I met my husband, that would mean going on the dating apps, even though it was really depressing, and going on dates with loads of creepy weirdos who didn't look like their profile pictures, and keeping myself feeling good and looking good so that if I stumbled across someone in a pub, I would have the guts to go and speak to them, and texting my then husband, now husband, sorry, finding an excuse to text him and asking him out for a drink, you know? So I think for anybody that finds himself in that position, I know it can feel really frustrating and you're sort of waiting for the universe to do its thing. But I think your role in that time is to just try and keep making positive momentum forward, even if it's just tiny little steps towards that end state, in the hope that the universe and you will conspire with each other and it will come right in the end.
I love that turn of phrase. The best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. The second best time is today. It makes me think, a few people recently, I've been talking to them about kind of how fast the earth is spinning. The earth is spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, but because of our context, we don't feel it, right? Because of gravity, because of like the atmosphere. And even though we're sort of hurtling through space and time at this like ridiculous speed. And in the context of the right now, it can feel really difficult to think that things are changing. But they're changing drastically. And in 5 years' time, the world's going to look completely different to what it looks like now. And you're so right. Our job is to use our agency to sort of nudge it in the right direction, to sort of influence what we can to keep putting in some inputs that might help push things in the right direction that we want. So you're absolutely right. Don't just sit there and wait for things to happen. Like, what's the little bits of agency that you can use today to move things in the right direction?
Yeah, exactly. It's like there's no such thing as luck. There's kind of preparation meets whatever opportunity presents itself to you. So, you know, that whole saying that we make our own luck. And I think that I wouldn't be sat here today running my own business, married to the man that I'm married to, on the cusp of having 2 children, if I hadn't taken some bold action that scared me to get here. And when we think about the fact that really the only thing so often standing in our way are our own self-limiting beliefs between what we want and where we are now, it's both a bit terrifying, but also kind of liberating too.
You know, it's been what a lovely conversation so far, by the way. You know, we're talking about like culture and leadership challenges, and we're kind of really diving into some really heartwarming territory, like some stuff that kind of gets you in the heart. So I hope anybody who's hearing Alice and I sort of ramble on for this first section, I hope there's some really good stuff for you to take away and think about just there. Like maybe if that has resonated, don't listen to the rest of this. Just kind of like write down a few thoughts about what you've already heard. But if actually you're here for the duration, welcome. It's lovely to have you here. Now, you mentioned there about taking bold action and, you know, being brave. And your company, Badass Unicorn, today works with some really interesting clients. We're talking clients like Google and McDonald's and Deliveroo and Bloom and Wild, who you mentioned before. Now, there obviously was a time when Badass Unicorn wasn't your world. And at some point you took a bold decision to make that your thing. So give us a bit of some headlines around your career history and kind of how you managed to make the call. Like, what were some of the inputs that you kind of weighed up at that time to be like, right, now is the time for me to do this other thing and to make that bold move?
So yeah, if we rewind 7 or 8 years ago, life looked very different. So I was working in marketing. I'd been in marketing for about 10 years and I'd risen through the ranks. I was always ambitious and always wanting to progress. So I was working at that time as the head of EU marketing for Deliveroo. And I was really determined. I wanted to be chief marketing officer by the time I was 35. And a lot of this was kind of driven by my ego, but also almost not really knowing that there might be an alternative path. And then I stumbled across personal development. I did a marketing scholarship called the Marketing Academy for any aspirational marketers who are into personal development. Look that stuff up. And I went on this course. I'd come to the end of a relationship that wasn't really right for me. And I don't know if it was being the end of the relationship, the fact that I always was quite interested in self-discovery, but I just took to this like a duck to water. And I started to believe some of the things that the people were saying in these workshops that they gave, that I could do anything that I wanted to do, that if I imagined it, if I could see it, I could create it. But I knew that the only way that I could kind of create this future that seemed really exciting was if I actually went out there and did the work to get there. So I fell in love with personal development. I started pursuing personal development. I started sharing about it on LinkedIn. I started putting videos out there before it was a thing. I was quite lucky because Deliveroo was one of the kind of jewels in the tech crown at that time, and unicorn companies were sort of in vogue. I got invited to speak at a lot of conferences. And I just kind of, what I now teach is a concept called follow the scent. These things energized me. They motivated me. I was really interested in them. And I just found as many ways as I possibly could to follow the scent of these things and say yes to things and try things out. And gradually this sort of passion project developed into a bit of a side hustle. I went down to 4 days a week in my marketing role to really pursue the side hustle. And at the same time, I had a really big career crisis. So I talked to you about how I was this high-flying marketing executive, right, working for Europe's fastest growing company, but I was demoted. So essentially, my strengths didn't lend themselves completely to marketing. There were some things I was quite good at, but there were other things like cohort analysis and numeracy, and like I'm quite strategic about my career, but with companies, it didn't really come naturally to me. And these were all of the things that I needed to do to kind of get to that next level of marketing. And because of that, I was demoted. I just couldn't keep pace with the demands of the role, and it sort of eclipsed me. And for somebody that's pretty ambitious and is using their status as a big ego push, it was a real come to Jesus moment. But it was a blessing in disguise, because picking myself up off the floor, using all the techniques that I'd learned on this marketing scholarship, I was like, okay, why did this happen? It's because I wasn't playing to my strengths. Okay, I'm going to create my own zeitgeist moment, that this is the moment that I pivot, that I go and start a new path or carve a new future for myself that's much more aligned with my strengths. And I didn't really know exactly what that was going to look like, but I was kind of like, how can I make this horror story into a fairy tale? And I continued going down this path of personal development. And then I started to try and monetize this thing. So asking for payments for speaking gigs, running my first ever courses. And then I transferred over to the learning and development team at Deliveroo, which I loved and was in for 6 months before redundancy hit me around the face at the beginning of COVID. And with a bit of a package behind me, I thought, sod it. Let's see if I can turn the £6,000 that I'd earned from my side hustle so far into something that could actually support me financially moving forward. And I'm really pleased to say that I registered as a limited company this year, having eclipsed 85k in revenue. I doubled my revenue year on year, and the business is really doing fantastically well, working with some incredible clients like you mentioned. So that was kind of the evolution and the story behind how Badass Unicorn came to be.
I think that's a really great story, because I think so often you're seeing the highlights reel on LinkedIn, and it can feel like people are an overnight success, that kind of thing. Whereas, actually your story is like, there were some real trials in there. And it wasn't that Badass Unicorn happened overnight. It was like, I'm going to experiment with this idea, apply some of the things that I've learned, see how that goes. And all the while, there are still big shifts happening, and there are still kind of like trials happening, like then you got made redundant. And, so there's a few things from the universe side kind of falling into place. But again, you were influencing the direction. You were kind of using your agency before that redundancy came to like nudge things in a direction that was going to benefit you. So I think that really connects to what you were saying before. But I love that story because it's so counter all the overnight kind of success stories and the highlights reels that we're seeing day to day. So I know that lots of people are going to get some real value from that. Now, we're here to talk about culture, and obviously we're going to talk about some leadership challenges as well and what people can do about them. And I know you've been thinking about some of your advice, what you want people to take away and try when this episode finishes. But before we get to that stuff, because it may be related, it may not. But in terms of a culture crush and kind of an organization or a person that you're looking to and thinking, yeah, I want to learn from them, or, I love what they're doing in the world. Who would that be and why?
So I'm not trying to suck up to my clients, but the company that I've chosen is one of my biggest clients. They're called Publicis. They're a French media agency, global. People on the call may have heard of, listening to the podcast, sorry, may have heard of like BBH, Zenith, some of those sort of like quite big media companies. And the reason that I've chosen them is really they epitomize and exemplify something that I think the best companies do when it comes to culture, which is invest in learning and development for their teams. I speak to lots of businesses about new business and business development and working together. And you'd be amazed at how many companies don't really have any budget set aside for this stuff. And I think it's the businesses that really understand how formative this is for their employees, how important it is for things like retention, and who create that space for learning that I have a huge amount of time for. And as my biggest client, Publicis, kind of screams of that investment. They've got a big L&D team. They invest very heavily in programs for their teams. And I think that says a lot about the culture that they're trying to build and the type of company that they want to be.
Publicis are massive, right? I mean, they're absolutely enormous. And when you've got companies like Publicis prioritizing things like learning and development and building these great programs for their employees to learn, grow, progress in their career, why do so many companies, you mentioned that lots of companies haven't got like budget set aside for these things. Why not? Like if the kind of like the more significant players in the industry are doing this kind of stuff, if they're prioritizing it, why do you think so many other companies just sort of gloss over it and don't bother?
This is where I find it almost difficult to get into the psyche of those types of companies. Look, businesses have to make decisions all the time about where they're investing budget. So perhaps they're investing in other things. And if you're looking at this with a glass half full kind of attitude, maybe they're creating like the best in class office space that's going to inspire their teams, or maybe they take everybody away on a ski trip for a week. I don't know, right? So maybe they're investing their budget in other things that aren't necessarily L&D related, but actually are really fantastic for culture. If we put our negativity hat on and think about glass half empty, and I've worked in some of these types of businesses before, people think that they don't have time. They can't necessarily see the return on investment directly enough to be able to say, okay, spending X thousands of pounds on this is going to result in Y. It's quite a progressive thing. So perhaps more old school people or old school companies just haven't quite cottoned on to the way that things are changing. So yeah, that would be my 2 cents worth.
I think I'd say if you're not doing that kind of stuff, hopefully, as Alice says, you are building this kind of incredible office environment and perhaps focusing your energy elsewhere. If you're not doing that, though, there's a reason why companies like Publicis become companies like Publicis, right? It's because they see that long-term plan and they're doing this kind of stuff over time. And it's how you keep the best people. It's how you come up with the best ideas. It's how you produce the best creative. It all starts with culture. So don't overlook this stuff. If you've got ambitions to grow your business and be the next Publicis or be the next whoever, right? Don't sleep on this stuff, because those companies are those companies because they do this kind of stuff. So don't sleep on it. Now,
you're right. I can also say my husband runs his own business much bigger than mine. I think he's got about 100 people. And as a small business owner with lots of different pressures and expectations, I think we can also just remind ourselves that it's not easy out there. And, especially in the current climate, etc. So folks are often doing as much as they can, as best as they can. But yes, if you can spare a thought for L&D, I'm sure it's going to pay dividends for you and your employees.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I talk often at Anthem through my business about is this model of intention, action, and outcome. And in it being not a solution, but a model for cultural practice. And we won't get into the details of this now because we're not here to talk about that. But I think you're absolutely right. Like, people are doing as much as they can. And your journey towards a great L&D program or a great professional development program or whatever it might be, it doesn't have to be something like we've talked already a few times in this episode about nudging things in the right direction, about using your agency today just to help shape what tomorrow looks like. And it might be that you're not in a position to really launch a great new program for a couple of years, but there are things you can do today to begin that journey and start moving and nudging things in the right direction. So I think you're absolutely right, Alice. And, people are stressed, stretched, have a million things to manage. But what's the little space that you might be able to create just to help move things in the right direction?
Well, exactly. And also, how can team members themselves take accountability for their learning? So perhaps if your organization doesn't have a huge program, but you see a course that you're really interested in, could you create a business case to ask for budget to do that? And if you're a decision maker in that business, do you allocate budget to that person and then maybe encourage them to bring learning back into the organization by running a lunch and learn? So I think I love the way that you've kind of honed in on this, taking small steps, iterative changes, creating your own luck type thing. Like, if your organization isn't one that's got a huge culture of L&D, you can start to be the change that you want to see, either as a decision maker or as a team member in that business, by bringing stuff to the table.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. So, leadership challenges. This kind of like our third chapter together. We've covered some really fantastic ground already, and it's been such a nice conversation. But we love to focus on like a specific kind of culture challenge or leadership challenge that people are facing, that you're seeing in the world around you, and also focusing on what leaders can do about that. And I know that you've got a few things in mind to talk us through. So why don't you take us through? Let's start with the challenge that you see, and then just roll into the solution as you see fit.
So the challenge that I want to talk about is a cultural challenge that can affect how safe people feel coming to work. So people may have heard of a concept called psychological safety. It's become a little bit of a buzzword over the past couple of years. And it's actually, in a very short space of time, become one of my most requested topics, and probably the workshop that has netted Badass Unicorn the most amount of revenue in its tenure. So for anybody that isn't sure what psychological safety is, it kind of says what it does on the tin, but essentially psychological safety was coined by a woman called Amy Edmondson. And it's all about having the psychological safety, which is a shared belief. So it's not often something that's felt by one person and not by everybody else. It's something that's a collective experience where people feel safe to kind of show up, be themselves, be their authentic selves, etc., and be able to speak up with their ideas, with concerns, with mistakes, with challenges, and not fear retribution, humiliation, or punishment. So this is where people might say, hey, have you thought about doing something a little bit like this? Or I've seen something that I'm worried about. Can I talk to you about this? Or I'm not sure we're making the right decision. And it being a space in which that's okay. So Amy Edmondson came to make this concept famous through a TED talk, which I'm sure you're going to share in the show notes. And essentially, she stumbled across it by accident. So she was seeking to understand, with a group of other physicians and scholars, do better hospitals make more or fewer medical drug errors? And logic would tell you that the better hospitals would probably make fewer medical errors, right? So when the results came back and they were the opposite of what she was expecting, i.e. the best hospitals or the best performing teams were reporting more medical errors than fewer, she scratched her head and thought, why would that be? And when she dug into it, she recognized that there was a correlation between a climate of openness, what she now calls psychological safety, that meant that people were able to learn from the mistakes of each other. So it wasn't that the best hospitals were making more mistakes than the, say, poorer hospitals or the poorer teams. It was that there was an openness to admit those, to report those, that then allowed those teams to learn from them and help them to improve and get better. And it reminds me of this story that a good friend of mine who's a consultant A&E doctor used when he talked about psychological safety in the healthcare profession. He talked about how we all know the story of the Titanic, right? The ship that couldn't sink. And a few years earlier, another very similar ship to the Titanic had done exactly the same voyage and had charted all the different icebergs along the route that would allow somebody, if they got hold of those logs, to know where those icebergs were and perhaps to be able to avoid the disaster that was the Titanic that killed 1,500 people if that information had been shared. So, we can all just think of those examples of, the amazing, the life-changing campaign that never happened because that executive didn't open their mouth during a brainstorm because they were too afraid, or the calamity mistake. Actually, they think the financial crisis could have been avoided if there was more psychological safety because everyone was just going along with groupthink, that nobody was challenging things. So if there was a better climate of safety for people to speak up and not be afraid of making a fool of themselves and people thinking that they were idiots, just think about some of the amazing change that could happen or things that may have been avoided.
I think that's such an interesting example with the Titanic. That really is. The idea that in the conditions of safety, you're able to share openly, point out the icebergs that lie ahead, and encourage people to take earlier action. It kind of relates to the conversation we were saying about, what are the ways that you can use your autonomy to influence the change going forward? Like if you don't have like a big L&D program or whatever, like if you don't make those cultural investments or start to think through, how do I create a culture of psychological safety here or a culture of personal development here early doors, there is an iceberg coming down the track. There are lots of businesses that we could point to where there's been a bit of a cultural collapse, or they stopped innovating, or they stopped creating, or they lost their cutting edge. They lost their teeth in a way. Because again, all of that stuff stems from your culture. It stems from ownership, innovation. It stems from people really being connected to the story of your business. And there are lots of businesses ahead of you that have crashed into the iceberg, and they're saying, don't do it. Invest in your culture, invest in your people. So I think that's such a great example for us to use. Now, obviously recognizing psychological safety and the importance of it is one thing, but engaging with it and actually taking action around that issue is quite another. And I know you've been thinking around solutions, frameworks, like ways for leaders to engage with this as a subject, take it from the abstract into action. So talk us through what those solutions or approaches might be.
Brilliant. Just before I do, just to stress the kind of business case behind psychological safety, because I think you touched on the fact that businesses might be heading for icebergs. And I love that sort of metaphor there. And, there might be businesses who think, oh, we don't have time for this, or it's too woke, or snowflakes and all of that type of thing. But what we can see from the data, and I'm sure people can navigate to this through the show notes, because I've shared various different papers in my summary sheet for psychological safety, is that if you want to get the highest performing teams, there is psychological safety. That's it. That's a fundamental foundation to it, particularly if you want to get the most from diverse teams. So diversity of background, diversity of gender, diversity of ethnicity, etc., etc. So we can see this correlation between performance and psychological safety. We can see that it drives things like retention, it drives collaboration, it drives quality of life up by 30%, as found by an Accenture study. So, if you want any more sort of stats around why psychological safety is so important, beyond just thinking about your own experiences and the teams where perhaps you thrive, there's likelihood, I would imagine, that they were psychologically safe environments versus the teams where you wanted to get out there as quick as you possibly could. Have a look in the show notes. So yes, in terms of building psychological safety practically, I have developed a framework that I call FIB, and it is a pyramid. And it didn't always used to look like a pyramid, but actually, as part of delivering lots of psychological safety workshops for my client Publicis, I kind of continued to develop the concept in almost collaboration with all the groups that I was working with, which is brilliant to see that sort of evolve. And so FIB stands for F, which is frame. So you've got that on one of the sides. And framing is all about literally creating a frame within which people can feel safe. So this is about creating kind of like a shared understanding, a shared communication of the context so that people understand where they're operating in. So these are things like agendas before meetings, having clear meeting titles so people know what it is that they're coming to a meeting for. This might be about having pronouns to demonstrate that, to frame that people may identify as different things. This could be an example of writing a brief. So job expectations, setting objectives, KPIs, these are all examples of framing, which creates a common understanding of the work and the context for all of the different people that might be associating with it. And we can all probably understand have you ever been to a meeting where there was no agenda, didn't know what it was about, there was no clarity of what we needed to achieve in the meeting, and you didn't feel particularly safe or like it was a particularly effective use of time. Whereas when you get sent the agenda in advance, maybe you delegate for it, maybe you prepare for it, and when a meeting is well managed, we get to the outcome much more efficiently. So you've got the F for framing. The I stands for inquiry. So inquiry is all about demonstrating and creating opportunities to show that people's perspectives are valued and appreciated. So this is about asking open questions. This is about asking for feedback and receiving feedback. This is about running post-campaign reviews. This is about creating the forums in meetings to have discussions. Like we've all been in a meeting, right, where somebody wanted to just present their slides. They didn't want you to ask any questions. They didn't want you to discuss anything, and they just want to get through them, right? Death by PowerPoint, the most boring meeting ever. What we want to think about is how are we creating opportunities within those meetings to ask questions of the group, to engage them with the content, to get their ideas, and not just creating a forum where extroverts feel like they can participate. Excuse me, can I just ask a question, right? But also perhaps creating these breakout discussions where people who perhaps have a more introverted preference or perhaps have different neurodiversions feel like they can contribute in a way that feels comfortable for them. Not everybody feels comfortable to just like open their mouths in front of a big room of people. One of my clients at Publicis, the kind of head honcho, so to speak, she says that if she's in a meeting and she's the most senior person in the room, she will make a point of not speaking or speaking last, because she knows that whatever she says might influence what other people say, which I just think is just such a fantastic way to think. We're always so wanting to talk, and I'm one of those people, and actually allowing other people to talk in our place is a really great demonstration of psychological safety. And then the B stands for bridging, and bridging goes at the bottom. And the reason that this became a pyramid of bridging goes at the bottom is because my experience is that where we build a bridge, so bridging is all about creating connection between the people of a team and the connection with whatever it is that you're trying to solve or work around. And whenever we have this bridge, so we have these close connections with the people that we're working with, or we have this real meaningful relationship with whatever work it is that we're doing, almost the other two things become much easier. So this becomes the bottom, because the framing, you can almost shortcut the framing. You don't need to do as much of it because you've already got those relationships there. So people sort of know all of this stuff already. And in terms of inquiry, people will do that organically. So when we're talking about bridging, this is about building meaningful relationships with folks. Of course, it's about having one-to-one meetings. It's about team socials, but it's also about connecting people to the why they should care about something. Making effort with people outside your just BFFs at work, for example. Like we were talking with the group at Publicis, how there were 2 desks for hot desking when people came in. What had just naturally happened was that all of the old guard, so all of the people that had been there for a couple of years, ended up navigating to one table. And therefore all the newbies ended up sitting at another table. So kind of like that episode of Friends, you know, where Joey's there as one of the tour guides, and you've got Ross there as the professor, and then you've got these people over there. Like inadvertently, your us and them is a bit strong, but you suddenly created these 2 groups, which you didn't even mean to do. Well, imagine if a couple of people said, hey guys, do you know what? Let's just switch this up. Let's all sit next to somebody different today, somebody that we don't normally sit to. And then we end up going to lunch with those people, and we go for a beer after work with the different people. And suddenly we've broken down some like unhelpful barriers that we didn't even mean to create. So yeah, that's the FIB framework. Hopefully a few different practical examples that folks can take away and use to try and amplify psychological safety in their teams.
I think the bridging element there, that's for me feels really, really crucial. Because when you think about onboarding, that day one experience for employees, like how does bridging translate into a discipline and a set of activities that you can do for people when they start on their first day? Or like, as you said, when you're hot desking at Publicis, like that introduces that sort of mindset shift into how can I demonstrate more care, practice the art of connection with people by remembering that bridging discipline. I think it's really interesting. Now, it's such a practical example, and I think really probably relatively easy to get started with this framework. But of course, it's one of those ones where you can never really master it. You just sort of get better and better at using it over time. Like maybe it's a tool for practice rather than a solution. Now, where do you think, if people are kind of brand new to this and that this is the first time they're hearing about the FIB framework, and they want to get started using it like right away, what's the one piece of advice, or what's the starting point for them? Like where should they focus their energy first in beginning to build meetings and shaping conversations using this tool?
So I think there's one thing that goes across all 3 of these areas, framing, inquiry, and bridging. And it's called demonstrating personal fallibility. So we are all built to not want to make ourselves look stupid, make ourselves look like we don't know what we're talking about. And we're all afraid of being ridiculed. If we look at the neuroscience behind this, it's because inherently we're pack animals, and we don't want to do things that might potentially throw us out of the metaphorical pack, i.e. sticking our head above the parapet and then everyone going, you're an idiot. You know, that would mean death if we were in the animal kingdom, right? So it's very understandable why we are kind of sometimes afraid to put ourselves forward in that way. And I think the thing that we can do as individuals, and I love this theme coming through about kind of personal ownership and what we can do, is demonstrating fallibility. So fallibility means that we're not perfect. Fallibility means that we are to err as human, to forgive divine, right? And it's about us finding ways to show up in our own style, our own personal brand, that we are human, that we make mistakes, that we go through challenging times. Now, for me, in my world, that looks like sharing very vulnerable posts on LinkedIn. It looks like having conversations with folks that immediately cut the crap and get us talking in a deep and meaningful way about the things that matter to them. For me, it means sharing my story about my demotion and redundancy, and the fact that I have generalized anxiety disorder, and the fact that I take sertraline for it, and the fact that I found working motherhood really challenging, and the fact I had postnatal depression. And I've always been a heart on my sleeve kind of gal. It was how I was built. I was raised in a house where we had these types of conversations. So I know that this is maybe extreme for some folks, and you don't have to be as extreme as me to demonstrate psychological safety or to help to build psychological safety. Perhaps for somebody that feels like they don't want to share quite as much, perhaps it's about finding small groups of people that you're okay with sharing some mistakes with, or having those types of conversations about, instead of like a public platform like LinkedIn. Or maybe if you're a manager, perhaps you don't want to announce to your big client that you're experiencing this healthcare issue. Fair enough. But maybe you are open to talking about some of the things that you learned from the mistakes that you made on a previous client, and how you are going to change things with this so that we are, learning from those. So it's really about understanding this concept of being open, showing that you're a real human, and then trying on different ways that feel comfortable to you to express that. And I think this will build connection with people, the bridge. This will give people the permission to open up. What I found is that you'd be amazed the number of beautiful DMs that I get when I share something quite vulnerable of, oh my gosh, you took the words out of my mouth. Thank you for making me feel like I'm not alone. Because when you engage with, and then they tell me stuff about them, and that might be friends, that might be work colleagues. So you get that inquiry out of the other person, and then you are framing that this is just the way that the way that we operate, and making that okay. So I think finding your own brand of personal fallibility would be my kind of key takeaway for folks to go and start practicing this.
I think that is such a lovely and powerful place to start, demonstrating personal fallibility. And I loved what you said there about whether you can engage, one or two people to begin experimenting with what does vulnerability look like for you. Because as you've said, you're a heart on your sleeve kind of person, and the same rules don't apply everywhere. The question is, how can somebody take that concept of practicing vulnerability for themselves, figuring out what's the dial, how can they turn that dial up just a little bit? And maybe to start with, it is just with one person or two people. Experiment with just being a bit more open and see how that feels. If it feels comfortable, maybe turn that dial up a little bit more. Maybe see if there's another person that you can speak to, and just try and find out what's the limit that is going to be helpful and healthy for you right now. And perhaps take it at that slow pace, just so you can try it on and see how it feels. Like Alice and I, we're not suggesting you go out there and you just start tell the world all your deep, dark fears. But maybe it's going to benefit you psychologically and make you more comfortable about being honest if you can just start dialing it up just slightly and seeing what level feels right for you. Demonstrating personal fallibility, I think that is just wonderful. And that pretty much, Alice, we're sort of coming into land here. It brings our time to a close. And it's been such a wonderful conversation. 34 weeks pregnant. Thank you for making the time for this, because I'm sure there are fans to be turned on, snacks to eat, lying down to be done. I don't want to make any assumptions about how you're going to enjoy the rest of your day, but I know that sitting in an uncomfortable office chair talking to me is probably not the physical priority right now. So thank you so much for making some time for Culture Crush, and let's speak again soon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Culture Crush. If you've enjoyed your time with us, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening from. And if you're a Culture First leader, be sure to visit anthem.oo because we've got lots in common. See you next time.